Hi BookTube, Aaron here. Hope you're doing okay. Today I'm going to be going through what I read in April, and then I'll give some fairly tentative reading plans for May. It'll really just be what I feel like I'm in the mood for at the moment. It might change as May goes on. Yeah, for April it was a pretty good reading month. As I said in my last sort of wrap up videos, I was feeling like I really wanted to concentrate on just reading what I was in the mood for. In April, I had a fairly kind of manic reading month in March, where I really was putting a lot of pressure on myself to finish certain books, and that was mainly due to reading books for the BookTube prize and having procrastinated a little bit in February. But I think it sort of carried over into my reading sort of generally as well. In April, I was dipping in and out of things. But all that being said, I did actually manage to finish 7 books. A lot of them are relatively short. They're short story collections, poetry collections, and there's one larger thing that I've just been chipping away at for some time. So let's jump into them. So that the first thing that I finished in April, it was the selected poems of Lawrence Durrell. And I think I brought this up in my wrap up for March, because I think I started this in March. Don't have too much to say. I'd recommend him. He's a solid poet. I wish it was a bit longer. This is really just a kind of sampling of his poems. There's a fairly generous introduction at the beginning. Yeah, how many pages of poetry is that? There's about 50 pages of poetry in here. So maybe a more generous selection would be pretty good. But he has quite a range of modes. There's some poems in here that are quite silly and satiric, others that are quite kind of artsy or surreal. And then there are some really quite sort of sincere poems in there as well, that feel like they're written to an old friend or to an old lover or something like that. So I'd recommend him. It's really solid poetry. Next up, I read A Time of Gifts by Patrick Leigh Fermor. This was to go along with a book club that Steve Donoghue and Mark from Book Time with Elvis said they were going to do. I think they both did read it, but they haven't really talked about it too much from what I can tell. And I read it at the beginning of April. There was part of me that was telling myself that since I'm trying to slow down in April, I'll just read it, sort of here and there, and I'll eventually get it finished, before the end of the month. But I think I read it in about a week, so it was just one of those books that a few pages in, I realised I was really going to enjoy, and it is probably my favourite thing that I've read so far this year. So this was, really, really good. And one of the things I really enjoyed, if I can find it for you, is that there's a map at the beginning. And I just really enjoyed, as I was reading through, just going back to the map. It's got these French flaps in it, so I could just keep the map sort of ready to go. And I'd just be following down where he was going. All the principal places that he visits are all on the map here, unless it's a place that he can't find on any modern maps. And it's, just really, really good. So again, I'd really, really recommend that. It's a really delightful book. And then for Pupil April, I read this. This is Yeats' The Man and the Masks by Richard Ellman. And this is a biography of W.B. Yeats. And Pupil April is an event by Elizabeth from Bookends and Books and Ros from Scaladandling about the books, where they're celebrating biographies, autobiographies, things like that. I've got a few biographies that I'd like to get to, so I thought I'd read this. And it was really, really good. It doesn't feel like a typical biography. He's, instead of just saying, going through, he lived here, he did this, he met this person, it's quite a kind of spiritual biography. I suppose it makes sense because Yeats saw himself as a very sort of spiritual person. He was fascinated with the occult, with spiritualism, with sort of all sorts of stuff. Theof, the Theosophists, Theosophitism. And so that was a huge part of his life. So it's like an autobiography of his inner life, and how those more spiritual sort of elements of his life kind of contrast and tug against his political convictions as well, and how at certain points they might reconcile, and in other points of his life they might break apart again. So it was really, really interesting. It felt like, in a way, a very abstract biography, but it kind of went deep into the subject in a way that I hadn't really read before, so that was really quite cool. And then there was a reread. I read Ariel by Sylvia Plath, one of my favourite all-time poets, and I mean it's just a landmark poetry collection, and I felt that these poems were sitting with me slightly differently this time through. I still really, really loved it. It was a great experience, but I think just different poems were standing out to me, so I was really enjoying the sequence of poems about bees and beekeeping towards the end. I was just really enjoying those, and there's some elements of humour in there, but also elements of dread and anxiety in there as well. So yeah, that was a really rewarding experience. The next one was something where I went out on a bit of a limb, and I read a writer that I've had on my horizon for a little while, and I decided to buy an ebook for it, so I'll pop up the cover digitally. I read it on my Kindle, and it was The Opal and Other Stories by Gustav Mayrink, and he was a Czech writer writing in German, I think at the end of the 1800s, maybe early 1900s, and they're very sort of gothic and very weird stories, and I largely enjoyed them. It was quite a wide, I think, selection of stories, and I thought some of the ones towards the end were a bit better. I'm actually kind of struggling to remember any like specific story titles in there that really, really stood out. But there's one about a guy who goes to visit one of his old professors, and this guy's job now is he's, I think, like an engineer, and he builds cars, he builds automobiles, and he goes to show his professor, to show that he's made something of his life and all of that. And the professor is just adamant that the internal combustion the internal combustion engine just can't exist, and by sheer power of will, the car won't start, because this man refuses to believe that it can work, that it's actually possible that this thing exists. So it was a really, really weird story. There were some in there that were sort of much more macabre, and there was one about just like a really weird, I think it was just called Fever, and it was just like a weird fever dream of this guy running out into the night, and there being a black raven and a white raven, and I think whichever sort of raven lands on your heart will kind of I don't really know. It was really weird, and kind of, I don't know, I felt like he's playing with in a few of them, like these ideas around predestination and stuff like that in there as well. So it was a really weird mix of ideas and influences in there. As I said, some of them are more gothic, more macabre. Some of the stories, even though there were magical and weird elements, had a little more of the adventure story to them. So I'm not explaining them very well. I'm not doing him justice, but it was pretty good. I quite enjoyed it, so I might pick up some more Mayrink in the future. Next up, a bit of a disappointment actually. I read Of Sunshine and Bedbugs, the essential stories of Isaac Babel. I just didn't really get on with Babel's writing at all. I just found him really, really boring. The selection is split up largely into 3 sections. So there's part 1, which is childhood and youth, and then part 2 is gangsters and other old Odessans, so stories about the underworld of Odessa in the early 20th century. And then part 3 is Red Cavalry, which I believe is actually more war correspondence really, rather than short stories. And he's taking very everyday occurrences and sort of using them for his stories. However, somehow he manages to make these events seem even more unremarkable than they actually are in real life. They just felt so sort of average and boring and sucked of actual life to me. I quite like, there's a story at the beginning called Guy de Maupassant, which is essentially just a story of, I think, him just being an impoverished writer, getting a job translating Guy de Maupassant, and that was actually quite a good story. He lives with some quite eccentric people. And the first story from the childhood stories, called The Story of My Dovecoat, which is just about him as a child trying to get the best grades he can, because if he gets the top grades, then his dad will let him buy a dovecoat and some doves, and then it just so happens that on the day he goes to pick up his doves, there's like a pogrom going on, and so it's quite a cataclysmic story. And those 2 were the best ones, and they were right at the beginning. So a bit disappointed with Isaac Babel. And then the last thing I finished it last night, so that was the very last day of April, was the complete poems of William Blake. I've been chipping away at Blake since, I think, January. I put him down for a bit, maybe in February or March, but it was really, really good. I really got the strong impression actually that as he's writing, he's gearing up towards something, and eventually that something is Jerusalem. Unfortunately, that sense that, yes, here we go, this is what we've been gearing up for, is really all I kind of took away from Jerusalem. A lot of it kind of went over my head. Kind of read through it and let it kind of wash over me. There were some kind of interludes in Jerusalem. There are 3 of them. There's one called to the Jews, to the deists, and to the Christians. They kind of caught my attention a little more. But it was a really weird and wonderful ride. It does feel like the equivalent I thought of was that it's kind of like going to a 12-hour long punk concert, which is amazing, but just kind of really, really tiring. It's a weird one. I feel like I didn't really get as much out of him as I would have liked. But I think in the future, now that I've had a kind of broad stroke of sort of everything that he wrote, I can pick a particular long poem that I want to tackle, and then just go at it and see what comes of that. So that was everything that I finished in April. However, as I said, I was kind of dipping in and out of things, and that was largely short story collections and things like that. And I think, the way I approached it really was, I would just think of a certain writer and just spend time with that writer for a little while and then move on to someone else. And so for a while I was reading a fair few Lydia Davis stories. This was mainly in the first half of April. I think I only read about sort of 40 pages worth of stories, so not a lot, but a fair bit. And I think I sort of found my favourite so far from her, which is called The House Plans. which is about a guy who wants to renovate a house and it doesn't exactly go to plan. I also picked up some Hemingway. I think the last video I put up was a book haul, and this is one of the books that I got. It's the collected stories of Hemingway, and I just read one story, and that was in Another Country, which was kind of the reason why I picked this up. I was in the mood to read that story, and I didn't have it, so I thought I'd just buy all of the Hemingway stories, and then I know I definitely have that story. Then I also read some Chekhov. I read, I think, 3 Chekhov stories. I read The House with the Mezzanine, which was quite a touching story, really tinged with nostalgia. I read The Peasants, which was very, very bleak, and I read Gooseberries as well, which was really, really lovely. So I might read some more Chekhov in May. I think Gooseberries is kind of part of a trilogy of stories, and it's like the middle story. So there's one called Man in a Case, I think, and another called About Love. And I think those 3 stories all kind of work together. So I might try and read those 2 stories, and it might contextualise Gooseberries a little bit. I also read a little bit of Borges, not quite as much as I would have liked. I dipped into his fictions, so I read a story called Etc., which is at the end of his first short story collection called A Universal History of Iniquity, I believe. Let's have a look. I think that's the title. Yeah, A Universal History of Iniquity, and the last story in there was Etc., which is kind of a collection of other really, really short stories. And from the last time I read A Universal History of Iniquity, I felt like that really was the highlight. So I just wanted to go back and see if it was as good as I remembered, and it was. And then I went to Ficciones, or Fictions, and I think I just read Tlon. So that's Tlon, Ukbar, and Orbis Tertius, which was just a great sort of mind-bending story about a kind of fantasy world, but it's kind of a mythological world that's part of the mythology of a country that doesn't exist. So there are these sort of layers to it like that, and then it sort of starts spilling into the real world. And it's one of my favourite short stories, probably my favourite Borges story. And I think that's all I read from the complete fictions. So I'll try and read some more Borges this month, mainly because I really want to make a video about my top 10 Borges stories, and I want to reread those top 10 stories just to make sure that they actually are my favourites. Maybe read a few other of the contenders, and then I'll make my mind up and finally get that video made. Before we let Borges go, I also read a little bit from the Book of Imaginary Beings. I read, how much is that? About 50 pages. So again, not a lot. I think I just, in a day or two, just when I was in the mood, I dipped into it. Unfortunately, this is quite a nice Penguin Deluxe edition. But as you might be able to see at the top, it came into a rather unfortunate encounter with a wet umbrella, and so it's a little beaten up now, but that's okay. I don't mind too much. And then the last book then for my dipping in and out was some Sherlock Holmes. So this is his greatest cases. So it's got The Hound of the Baskervilles in it, and then it's got Conan Doyle's favourite, I think, 12 Sherlock Holmes stories. And let's see, I'll try and work out how many of these I read. So I think I read, earlier in the year I read A Scandal in Bohemia and The Red-Headed League. And then last month I read The Five Orange Pips, The Adventure of the Speckled Band, which is one of my favourites. the Musgrave Ritual, which I really liked as well. The Reigate Squires, which was okay. The Final Problem, which I thought was a little disappointing. And The Adventure of the Empty House, which was, yeah, that was pretty good. And then there are 4 short stories left in here. So there's The Adventure of the Dancing Men, The Adventure of the Priory School, The Adventure of the Second Stain, and The Adventure of the Devil's Foot. So I might read those 4 stories in May. And then at some point I might read The Hound of the Baskervilles as well, because it's been quite a while since I've read that. And then, it feels like May's going on forever. Then I've just got the 4 ongoing books. So there are 2 quite long ongoing books I'm just sort of dipping in and out of. One of those is Istanbul, A Tale of 3 Cities by Bettany Hughes. I've been reading that on my Kindle, and that's largely been my book for when I'm commuting, and it's quite an easy one to dip in and out of, and yeah, I've really been quite enjoying that. I've been sort of reading it to go along with Historathon, which is a year-long reading event encouraging you to read a bit more history, and they have different periods for every quarter of the year. So now we're firmly in the second quarter, so we're reading a lot of stuff sort of loosely in the sort of medieval period. I've managed to sort of span the whole medieval period for Byzantium and the Ottoman conquest and all of that. So that's been pretty good, and it's just a total I don't know, not a change of pace, but I've just had to it's just culturally so different once the Ottomans take over, and yeah, it's so beautiful and rich as well. So it's I don't know really anything about the Ottoman period, so that's going to be really, really fun to find out about. Then I've been reading Remembrance of Things Past by Marcel Proust. I think I started it last May, so it's nearly been a year that I've been reading this. Although I think I only started seriously reading it in June. And I'm in the 4th volume at the moment, which is called Cities of the Plain. I think that's sometimes translated as Sodom and Gomorrah, just in case you don't know what the Cities of the Plain is alluding to. And it's been really, really good. It's been reminding me of what I really love about Proust, which, in this volume and the volume before, there have been a lot of really long sections that are just these dinner parties and salons and these sort of fragments of conversation. And although they are interesting and fun, what you really, really read Proust for is for his reveries and just these sort of daydreams that spill into each other, and he's just sort of trying to understand these different topics. And I just read a bit where he's kind of coming to terms with grief. He's visiting a place that he once visited with his grandmother, and between now and then his grandmother's died, and I think up until that point, the fact that his grandmother's dead, that he's never going to see her again, hadn't really hit him that hard. But now he's in this place and now he's without her, it's hit him really quite hard, and it's just been really, really good. And as he's going through these issues, these reveries, he makes you feel like you're experiencing what he's writing about. So with grief, you kind of feel the grief when he's talking about love or heartbreak. You kind of feel that too. But then the way he goes about it, he's kind of consoling you at the same time. So it's really quite odd, but kind of relaxing, and I don't know. I've just really come to love it and really appreciate it. Okay, the sun is kind of going down as I'm recording, so I had to briefly pause to reset things because it was getting a bit dark in here. But next up is The Republic by Plato. Don't quite know why I decided to pick this up. Well, no, I do know. I was watching a video made by Gareth from Books, Songs and Other Magic, and it was his just video about about philosophy sort of in general, about the areas of philosophy that interest him and why they're important, and some sort of useful places to start in each area. And I picked up Republic a little earlier this year, and it's one of those things, like a lot of philosophy, I've never really read kind of a full work of philosophy all the way through, really. I've read the occasional essay or chapter when it was kind of pertinent to something else that I was reading. And so I thought I'd give it a go and just read it all the way through. And it's been really, really good so far. It's so surprisingly readable, and you can just sort of fall into it. And so as a reading experience, it's really good. As far as the ideas go, initially I found myself nodding my head a lot, and then as they're following their arguments, it's very much sort of tunnel vision, very blinkered, and they're just following an argument to its conclusion, and I'm not entirely sure how I feel about where it's going and certain implications. But I think lots of people, would probably agree. Then next up, we've got selected poems by W.H. Auden. I think I'm about halfway through this now, and I think I've talked about Auden a fair bit as I've been reading this, and I've just been really appreciating Auden. He's just such a skillful, amazing poet. Like Lawrence Durrell earlier, he's just really good at moving between different registers and modes. He's really, really comfortable writing in form, but he can sort of push past it, but it never feels loose. It always feels very chiseled, very well thought out, and very considered. So yeah, it's been really, really good. And I've actually a while ago I picked up the second half of a biography about Auden called Later Auden, and it's by Edward Mendelsohn, who edited this. And I recently picked up Early Auden. I think it was sort of after I made my book haul video. So eventually I'll do a bit of a deep dive and read through those biographies, and hopefully that'll shed some more light onto the sort of context for some of those poems. So that took a while to get through those, but I'll very quickly go through my plans for May. And as I said, these are just kind of what I'm feeling at the moment, the kind of books I might want to read. At the top of the list is Alone in Berlin by Hans Fallada. Again, I think since the end of last year, I've been continually saying that I'd really like to read this book. So once again, I'd really like to read this book. And if you haven't seen me talk about this yet, it's from what I can tell so far, a kind of cat and mouse game between a man who decides to kind of post these rebellious postcards through people's doors during World War II in Berlin, and so a cat and mouse game between him and a member of the Gestapo. So yeah, we'll see what that's like, but I'd really quite like to get to it. So that's at the top of the list for May. Close behind that then is The Age of Innocence by Edith Wharton. Don't think I've ever read anything by Edith Wharton, so I'd really like to get to this and maybe watch the film as well. I've never seen that. Then we've got Hypnos by René Char. So I hauled this recently, and it's a slim selection of prose poems that he sort of developed out of his notebooks when he was part of the French Resistance. So should be interesting. I've only read a couple of poems by René Char before, but I've quite liked him. So we'll see. Then next up, we've got To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. All I've read so far is Mrs. Dalloway. I think I read a short story by Virginia Woolf, but it was years ago. I can't really remember what it was or what it was about. But yeah, I'd like to read some more Virginia Woolf. Sorry, I'm kind of speeding through these. And then we've got We by Yevgeny Zamyatin, which I again picked up quite recently. And in the book haul video that I made that this was in, I think quite a few people were saying that they read it and enjoyed it, and it's kind of a precursor to 1984 and things like that, and that George Orwell probably just ripped this off. Yeah, we'll see, I suppose. Then we've got Rashomon and 17 Other Stories by Ryonosuke Akutagawa. Oh no, I got so close. Akutagawa. Oh dear. Anyway, I'll have it. I'll try to remember to put that in the description. But some Japanese short stories, and again, this might be something I dip into. I might continue to try and dip into some more short story collections as we move into May. And then I'd also quite like to read some Kafka. I've got his complete novels here, so I might read The Castle in May if I have time. But also in the back of my head, I would quite like to read something by Anne Bronte. Where is she? Here she is. So I might read The Tenant of Wellfell Hall, and I think these two are kind of in the same position, so it'll just be, if I read, in fact this might actually be higher than We and stuff like that, so I don't know, I might try and read this as well. A late addition to the pile of possibilities. But anyway, so I might try and read The Castle, or I might try and read The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. We'll see. We'll see where I go. But yeah, as I said, that's a tentative list of a pile of possibilities. I think really with that pile, it's the first two that I'm more committed to, and then the rest we'll just see how it goes. But there we go, that's this video. I hope it hasn't rambled on for too long. I might try and edit it a bit to make it a bit shorter. But for now, thank you very much for watching. I hope you've had a really lovely reading month in April, and yeah, all the best for May. So yeah, once again, thank you, and I'll see you soon.